The day Wilhelmina Whitaker sat down across from Gilbert Hunter without asking permission was the day 30 years of silence finally had something to answer to. Gilbert Hunter had arrived in the San Luis Valley of Colorado Territory in the spring of 1858 with nothing more than a bedroll, a mule named Ezra, and a stubbornness so deeply rooted in his chest that even the howling winter winds that came screaming down off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains had never been able to dislodge it. He had been 22 years old, lean as a fence post and twice as hard, with calloused hands and a jaw that looked as though it had been carved from the same red rock that jutted out of the foothills to the east. He had looked out across that wide, grass-thick valley floor with the Rio Grande glittering silver in the distance and the cottonwoods swaying along its banks, and he had made himself a promise so quiet and so fierce that it never needed to be spoken aloud. He was going to build something that would last. He had started with his hands and Ezra's back, cutting timber from the pine forests higher up the slopes and dragging it down to the flat ground he had staked out near a reliable spring-fed creek. He had built a one-room cabin that first winter, sleeping inside it before the roof was even properly sealed, the snow dusting through gaps in the logs and settling on his blanket like a thin, cold blessing. He had told himself it was fine. He had told himself a great many things in those early years, mostly in the voice of necessity, because there was no one else there to tell him anything at all. The valley in those days was a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary hardship in equal measure. The Ute people moved through it as they always had, following patterns that went back generations, and Gilbert had learned quickly that respect was a currency worth more than silver in that particular stretch of country. He had traded fairly, kept his fences where he said he would keep them, and made no enemies where he could avoid it. In a land where men made enemies the way other men made breakfast, this was not a small thing. By 1865, he had 300 head of cattle bearing his brand, a simple H pressed into a circle, which is one hired hand, a former Confederate soldier named Thomas Pryor, who had come west to forget the war, had taken to calling the ring H by 1870. He had 500 head and a proper ranch house built of river stone and milled timber, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and glass windows that had come by wagon from Santa Fe at a cost that had made Gilbert wince so hard his eye had watered. By 1878, he had hired 4 full-time hands, built a second bunkhouse, expanded his grazing rights through careful negotiation, and one mildly tense standoff with a neighboring rancher, named Calhoun, who had eventually backed down, because even Calhoun could see that Gilbert Hunter was not a man you moved when he had decided to stand still. By 1888, the Ring H spread was widely acknowledged as the finest working cattle ranch in the San Luis Valley, and possibly the finest for 200 miles in any direction. It was a place of order and function and quiet pride. The fences were tight and square. The cattle were fat and well-watered. The hands were paid on time and fed well and treated fairly, which was not as common a thing as it ought to have been. Visitors to the valley who had business at the Ring H always remarked upon the same things. The sheer scale of the operation, the beautiful stone house sitting like something permanent against the backdrop of those ancient mountains, and the fact that the owner ate every single meal alone at the long oak table in the dining room, served by his housekeeper Maria Sandoval, who had worked for him for 11 years, and who had long since given up trying to draw him into conversation during mealtimes because the man simply would not be drawn. Gilbert Hunter had, at the age of 52, perfected the art of solitude so completely that it had become invisible to him. He did not feel lonely. He was very clear on this point in the rare moments he turned inward to examine the question. Loneliness was an absence you felt. What he had was simply a presence of one, and that presence was sufficient. He had the ranch. He had the horses and the cattle and the wide sky and the work, always the work, which was its own kind of conversation. He had never married. This was a subject that the people of Alamosa, the nearest proper town, had been discussing with varying degrees of fascination and bafflement for the better part of 2 decades. There had been women over the years, a widow in town named Clara Beecham who had made her interest known in 1874 and been politely but unmistakably discouraged, and a schoolteacher from back east who had come through in 1881 and spent 3 weeks at the Valley Hotel, and had ridden out to the Ring H twice on social calls that Gilbert had received with careful courtesy and equal careful distance. People had theories. People always had theories. The most popular one was that he had loved someone back east before he came out here, and that she had died or left him, and that he had simply closed himself up around that wound and kept going. Thomas Pryor, who was now retired and living on a small spread of his own not far from the Ring H, had his own theory, which he shared with no one because it was too simple to make a good story. He believed Gilbert Hunter had simply never stopped long enough to let someone catch up to him. October of 1888 arrived in the San Luis Valley like a slow fire, the aspens up on the mountain slopes going gold and copper and a screaming brilliant orange, the mornings sharp and clean, and smelling of frost on dry grass. Gilbert had ridden out early that particular Tuesday to check the northern fence line where one of his hands, a young man named Cord Mullins, had reported a section going soft. He had ridden along 3 miles of fence, found the problem, repaired it himself while Cord held the wire, and ridden back to the ranch house in time for the midday meal, feeling the particular deep satisfaction of a thing done right with your own 2 hands. Maria had made a beef stew with dried chilies and corn, and she had set it at the head of the long oak table as she always did, along with a half-loaf of bread and a cup of strong coffee, and then she had retreated to the kitchen, because that was the arrangement and it had worked for 11 years. Gilbert pulled out his chair, sat down, unfolded his napkin, and was reaching for the bread when the front door of the ranch house opened, and a woman he had never seen before in his life walked straight through it and sat down across from him. She did not knock. She did not ask. She simply came through the door, crossed the room with a stride that was tired but entirely deliberate, pulled out the chair directly opposite his at the far end of the table and sat down. She set a carpetbag on the floor beside her feet. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at him. Gilbert Hunter held the bread in his hand and looked back. She was perhaps 35 or 36 years old, with dark auburn hair that had come half loose from its pins during what appeared to have been a considerable journey, given the road dust on her traveling coat and the worn-down look of her boots. Her face was striking rather than conventionally pretty strong cheekbones, a determined set to her jaw, brown eyes that were currently doing the work of taking in the entire room, and the man at the end of it with a directness that Gilbert associated more with cattle assessors than with visiting strangers. She was not small. She had the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of refusing to fold under pressure. "You are Gilbert Hunter," she said. Her voice was clear and slightly husky and did not tremble. "I am," he said. "My name is Wilhelmina Whitaker. I have been traveling for 11 days. I am going to ask Maria or whoever cooked that stew for a bowl of it, and then I am going to explain why I am here, in that order if you do not object." Gilbert looked at her for another full 3 seconds. Then he set the bread down and called toward the kitchen. "Maria, another bowl, please." There was a short pause from the kitchen, followed by the unmistakable sound of Maria Sandoval deciding not to ask a single question, which was itself a kind of answer. Wilhelmina Whitaker folded her hands and waited with the patience of someone who had been waiting a long time for things considerably more difficult than soup. Maria brought the bowl and retreated again. Wilhelmina picked up her spoon, tasted the stew, closed her eyes for one moment in what was clearly genuine relief, and then opened them and looked at Gilbert again. "My brother is Clement Whitaker," she said. "He worked for you for about 2 years, starting in 1884. Gilbert thought about it. Clement Whitaker had been a quiet, capable cowhand, good with horses, unremarkable in most ways except for the fact that he had never once complained about anything, which Gilbert had always privately respected. He had left the Ring H in the spring of 1886 without much explanation, which was not unusual. Cowboys came and went like weather. "I remember him," Gilbert said. "He is dead," Wilhelmina said. She said it flatly, not as a performance of grief, but as a fact she had already processed through many times and was now simply delivering. "He died in July. A horse fell on him during a river crossing near Pueblo. He was working for a freight outfit by then. I am sorry to hear it." "Thank you." She ate another spoonful of stew. "Before he died, he wrote me a letter. He wrote me several letters over the years, actually, but this one was particular. He told me that the San Luis Valley was the finest country he had ever seen, and that the Ring H was the finest ranch in it, and that a man named Gilbert Hunter had run it for 30 years with more patience and skill than anyone he had worked for before or since." She paused. "He also told me that you were alone out here and that the valley needed more people like you in it, and fewer people like the ones I had been living around." Gilbert watched her carefully. "What kind of people had you been living around?" "The kind who make promises and break them," she said, with a simplicity so complete that it functioned as an entire biography. "I was in Kansas, Wichita first, and then a smaller town called Harton that you will not have heard of. I was married for 6 years to a man who turned out to be considerably more interested in other people's money and other people's wives than in anything that was actually his. I left him in April of this year. The divorce was granted in August." She said this the way someone says a thing they have rehearsed being unashamed of. "I have $43, a carpet bag, and a recommendation from my late brother. I am 36 years old. I can cook, sew, manage accounts, ride a horse, and I learn things quickly. I am looking for honest work." Gilbert Hunter had not moved during this recitation. The stew in front of him was growing cold. "You rode out here from a limosa?" he asked. "I borrowed a horse from the livery stable. I will return it tomorrow." "You borrowed a horse and rode 11 miles out to a ranch you had never been to, sat down at a stranger's table without asking, and told him your entire personal history." "I told you the relevant portions," Wilhelmina said calmly. "And yes," something moved in Gilbert's chest. It was so unfamiliar that for a moment he genuinely could not identify it. It was not irritation, though he examined that possibility. It was not suspicion, though that would have been reasonable. It was something closer to recognition, which made absolutely no sense, but there it was. "What kind of work are you looking for?" he said. "Whatever you need most," she said. "Maria, I assume that is her name, appears to be managing the household competently. But a ranch this size generates a great deal of paperwork, from what Clement's letters described. Supply orders, payroll records, cattle tallies, correspondence with buyers. My father was a dry goods merchant. I kept his books from the age of 14 until I married at 28. I am very good with numbers." Gilbert ate a bite of his stew, which had indeed gone somewhat cold. He chewed it and thought about the stack of papers currently occupying the corner of his study that he had been avoiding for 2 weeks because he hated the bookkeeping with a passion second only to his hatred of dishonest men. His previous clerk, a young man named Ferris, had left in September to marry a girl in Denver. "The pay would be $12 a month," he said. "You would have the room at the east end of the house. Maria uses the room off the kitchen. The hands are in the bunkhouse. Meals are taken in this room." He paused. "Separately, generally." "I noticed," Wilhelmina said, with the faintest edge of something not quite amusement but adjacent to it. "That seems a lonely way to eat. I have found it sufficient." "I am sure you have," she said, in a tone that managed to be neither agreeable nor disagreeable, but something that Gilbert would spend the next 3 days turning over in his mind before he identified it as simply honest. She ate the rest of her stew. He ate the rest of his. The fire in the hearth at the far end of the room crackled and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek with a sound like rushing water. When she finished, she folded her napkin with precise care, thanked him for the meal, picked up her carpetbag, and asked Maria, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway with impeccable timing, to show her to the east room. Gilbert sat alone at his long oak table for some time after that, looking at the empty chair across from him. It was the first time in 30 years that the chair had not simply been empty. It had been occupied. It had been occupied by a woman who had sat down without asking permission and proceeded to be the most direct person he had met in at least a decade, possibly longer, and who had eaten her stew with the focused appreciation of someone who had been genuinely hungry and was not going to pretend otherwise. He picked up his coffee cup. It was cold. He drank it anyway. Wilhelmina began work the following morning, which was Wednesday, appearing in the doorway of Gilbert's study at precisely 7 in the morning. He knew it was precise because he had just wound the clock on the mantelpiece and looked at it, wearing a plain dark blue dress and her hair properly pinned. She surveyed the corner of papers with the expression of a person confronting a manageable disaster. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the desk that had belonged to the departed Ferris. "Help yourself," Gilbert said, and returned to the letter he was writing to a cattle buyer in Denver. She worked with a focused, unhurried efficiency that he found himself noticing out of the corner of his eye over the next several hours. She sorted the paper's first cattle tallies here, supply receipts there, outstanding correspondence in its own pile, and then she began on the tallies, pulling a leather-bound ledger from the desk drawer and starting fresh columns in a handwriting that, when he happened to glance over, was clean and even and clearly the product of proper schooling. She asked him 4 questions that morning. Each question was specific, practical, and had a precise answer that she wrote down and immediately applied. She did not make conversation. She did not fill silences with chatter. When noon came, she set down her pen, straightened the papers with a neat tap on the desk edge, and went to the dining room for the midday meal. She sat across from him, not at the other end of the table as she had the day before, but midway down, which put her across from him and slightly to his left, which meant that if he looked up from his plate he could see her without needing to turn his head. He was not sure if this was deliberate. He thought it probably was. "The cattle buyer in Pueblo," she said after a moment. "Harlan Reeves. There are 3 letters from him in the correspondence pile that you have not answered. The oldest is from September 14th. "I am aware," Gilbert said. "He appears to be offering a strong price for spring stock. Are you planning to respond?" "I was intending to ride into a Lamosa next week and send a telegraph." "You could write the letter today. The reply column I set up in the ledger has a note section." Gilbert looked at her. "Are you telling me how to run my business, Miss Whitaker?" Wilhelmina considered this with what appeared to be genuine fairness. "I am suggesting an efficiency," she said. "You may ignore it entirely." He found, to his mild bewilderment, that he did not particularly want to ignore it. "I will write the letter after noon," he said. "Good." She ate a bite of the cornbread Maria had made. "The spring account, by the way, the water rights documentation. It is in the pile, but I did not fully understand the legal notation. There appears to be a boundary question with a neighboring claim." Gilbert set down his fork. "Where did you find that?" "Bottom of the pile. It had been there for a while, I think. The paper had gone somewhat yellow at the corners." The document in question was a dispute that had been simmering for 2 years with a rancher named Aldous Trent, who had purchased the spread to the north of the Ring H in 1886, and had since been quietly, persistently, and illegally encroaching on the water rights to Cottonwood Creek that Gilbert had held since 1869. Gilbert's lawyer in Alamosa, a man named Pickett, had sent that document along with a letter recommending action, and Gilbert had put it in the pile and not looked at it again, because he had been dealing with a difficult calving season and a broken fence and a hand who had quit without notice, and because he had a deep, philosophical resistance to the kind of petty territorial squabbling that Aldous Trent seemed to thrive on. "I will deal with it," he said. "I could write the summary letter to your lawyer if you wanted to give me the details," Wilhelmina said. "Legal correspondence is not different from business correspondence in terms of organization. You tell me the facts, I write them down clearly, and Mr. Pickett has what he needs to proceed." Gilbert looked at her for a long moment. You did your husband's business correspondence as well, and his personal correspondence toward the end, she said, and then something passed briefly across her face, gone before he could name it. He was not a thorough man. The thoroughness fell to me. She said it without bitterness, which was somehow sadder than bitterness would have been. Yes, Gilbert said. You can write the letter to Pickett. What followed over the next several weeks was a reorganization so thorough and efficient that Gilbert's foreman, a weathered and broadly competent man named Hector Garza, who had been with the Ring H for 7 years, came to Gilbert at the end of the 3rd week and said with the frankest admiration that the ranch's accounts had never looked cleaner, that the supply orders had gone out 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and that he had no idea how Gilbert had managed it. I hired a bookkeeper, Gilbert said. I know who you hired, Hector said, in the tone of a man reporting something he has been thinking about for a while. The men are a little at a loss as to what to make of her. She is here to keep the books. She fixed Cord's saddle yesterday, Hector said. The stitching on the cinch had been going for a month and nobody had gotten around to it. She apparently just sat down on the bunkhouse step with a needle and waxed thread and did it. That is not part of her employment, Gilbert said. No, Hector agreed. She seemed to know that. She just did it anyway. Gilbert did not say anything for a moment. She knows horses. Seems to. She asked Cord some very specific questions about the sorrel gelding that has been going slightly off in the left front, and whatever she suggested, the horse seems easier today. She grew up around horses. You would know that better than I would, Hector said carefully. Gilbert did not respond to this. He was aware that there was something implicit in Hector's tone, something careful and knowing that Hector, as a man of considerable diplomacy, was choosing not to make explicit. He chose, similarly, not to make it explicit. That evening, however, he found himself sitting on the covered porch after supper. They had, without either of them formally acknowledging it, begun taking supper together as a matter of course, because Wilhelmina had simply sat down across from him on the 3rd evening, and the arrangement had continued. And when Wilhelmina came out onto the porch with a cup of coffee and settled into the other chair, looking out at the dark valley with the mountains black against a sky absolutely drowning in stars, he said, "Where did you learn to work with horses?" She looked at the stars for a moment before answering. "My father kept horses. Not ranch horses, good saddle horses. He loved them more than most things and considerably more than some people. He used to say that a horse tells you more truth in 5 minutes than a man will tell you in 5 years. A pause. I came to agree with him. Your brother was good with horses too, Gilbert said. We both inherited it from father. She sipped her coffee. Clement wrote me that you had some of the finest stock he had seen outside of Kentucky. He was not given to flattery. No, Gilbert agreed. He was not. He looked out at the dark. A coyote called somewhere to the south, and another answered it, the sounds crossing in the cold air like conversation. He was a good hand. I was sorry when he left. He left because of a woman in Pueblo, Wilhelmina said. It did not work out. It rarely did for Clement. He chose women the way he chose rivers to cross, the harder the better. There was deep affection in this and old grief below it, and she did not try to conceal either one. You were close, Gilbert said. He was all I had left, really. After our father died, that was 1880, and after my marriage went the way it went. She looked down at the cup in her hands. He used to write me long letters, mostly about places. He had a gift for description. He made this valley sound like something from a painting. He was not wrong about that. No. She looked up at the mountains, invisible in the darkness but present the way things that have always been there are present, felt rather than seen. He was not wrong about a great deal, it turns out. Gilbert did not ask her to elaborate on that, but he thought about it for a long time after she went inside, sitting in the cold and the starlight, watching the mountains he could not see. November came and the first real snow fell. A thin, early dusting that silvered the grass and vanished by noon, and then a heavier storm at the end of the month that put 8 inches on the ground and kept everyone inside for 2 days. Gilbert had lived through 30 Colorado winters, and had his preparations well in hand. The hay was stacked, and the cattle were shifted to the southern pastures, and the stove wood was piled high on the porch. But what he had not prepared for was spending 2 days largely confined to the ranch house with Wilhelmina Whitaker, who, it turned out, became more herself when the ordinary business of the world slowed down. She read. She had a small collection of books in the East Room, and she brought 2 of them out to the main room and read by the fire with the focused pleasure of someone for whom reading had been a private refuge. He caught himself looking at her more than was strictly necessary. He noted this, examined it, and set it aside, which was his standard procedure for observations about himself that he did not know what to do with yet. On the second evening of the snowstorm, with the wind pressing hard against the shuttered windows and Maria's venison stew sending fragrance through the whole house, Wilhelmina looked up from her book and said, "Did you always intend to build a ranch, or did the valley simply present itself?" It was the first personal question she had asked him, and he noticed that as much as the question itself. "Both," he said. "I came west intending to build something. The valley was where the road ran out, more or less. I looked at it and stayed. Just like that. I had a mule and a bedroll and very little to recommend me going back," he said. "East did not have anything I particularly needed. Family, a mother in Ohio who died in 1863, a father I had not spoken to since I left." He said it plainly. "We did not see the world the same way. He did not want you to go. He wanted me to stay and work his farm and inherit his disagreeable temperament," Gilbert said. "I was willing to do one of those things and not the others." Wilhelmina's mouth curved. It was not the first time he had seen it, but it still caught him slightly off guard, because her smiles were rare and therefore carried more weight than the smiles of people who gave them freely. "What about friends, before you came out here?" "I had a few in the army," he said. He saw her register that. "I served briefly in 61 and 62. Infantry. I was mustered out after Shiloh with a ball in my shoulder that took a year to stop giving me trouble." He touched the old shoulder with the unconscious habit of a man who has long since made peace with an injury. "I came west not long after. Some of those men I stayed in touch with for a while. Time and distance do their work." "Yes," she said softly, "they do. You had friends in Kansas. Women I knew through the church and the general store. The kind of friendships that exist around a common social context and dissolve when the context changes." She considered this. "One true friend, a woman named Ruth Caldwell, who had come out from Indiana the same year I married. She wrote me a very good letter when I left my husband. She said it took longer courage than it took short courage, and she admired both kinds in equal measure. That is a good friend. She was. She went to California in the spring. I have her address." Wilhelmina closed her book, keeping her place with one finger. "Did you ever wish you had chosen differently, any of it?" The question settled into the room and stayed there. Gilbert did not rush at it. He thought about the question genuinely, the way he thought about all things that mattered, slowly from the outside in, like circling a fire to feel where the heat was strongest. "There are things I might have done differently," he said at last. "The way I did them was not always the only way, but the ranch itself." He stopped. He tried again. "No," he said. "I do not wish I had not built it. It is the truest thing I have ever done." Wilhelmina looked at him steadily. "The truest thing," she repeated, as though tasting the words. "A man's work tells the truth about him even when he will not," Gilbert said. "The Ring H tells the truth about me. Every fence post, every head of stock, every acre I have held and worked and kept in order. 30 years of truth." He paused. "It is not everything a life might contain, but it is not nothing." "No," Wilhelmina said quietly. "It is a very long way from nothing." She went back to her book. He went back to the saddle leather work he had been doing. But something had shifted in the room, something small and significant, the way a stone shifts when a river has been running over it long enough, the change invisible in the moment, its consequences only understood later. December came. The Trent water rights dispute, which Wilhelmina had drafted a very clear and organized letter about, came to a satisfying legal resolution when Aldous Trent's claim was found to be based on a document that he had altered himself. A discovery made easier by the fact that Wilhelmina had thought to request the original survey maps from the county land office in Alamosa, and had compared them with the documents Trent had submitted, finding a discrepancy that she flagged in a quiet, factual note to Pickett the lawyer that had apparently made Pickett nearly fall off his chair with the clarity of the evidence. Trent paid a fine and backed off the creek boundary, and the Ring H's water rights were formally affirmed by the county court just before Christmas. Gilbert told Wilhelmina at supper that evening. He watched her face carefully. She did not make much of it outwardly. She said that was a good outcome and that she was glad the matter was resolved, and then she asked whether he had heard from the Denver buyer about the spring stock. But her shoulders settled slightly, the way a person's shoulders settle when something that has been quietly occupying a corner of their attention is finished, and he saw that she had cared about the outcome rather more than she had let on. He realized he liked that about her. He realized he had been noticing things he liked about her for several weeks in a growing, quiet accumulation that he had been handling the way he handled most personal revelations, by stacking them neatly in a corner of himself and periodically checking whether they added up to something. They were beginning to add up to something. The hands had their own opinions, naturally. Cowboys were, as a class, constitutionally unable to refrain from opinions about matters that were none of their business, and Gilbert's 4 current hands, Hector Garza, Cord Mullins, a third man named Pete Abelson who had been with the Ring H for 4 years, and a young man named Tommy Reyes who was 19 and tended to follow Cord everywhere like a large, good-natured shadow, had been discussing the situation at the Ring H in the bunkhouse with varying degrees of subtlety since approximately the second week of Wilhelmina's employment. Cord's position, which he expressed to Tommy in the sort of low, carrying whisper that he apparently believed was confidential, was that it was about time, because the boss had been rattling around in that big stone house like a marble in an empty can for as long as anyone had known him, and the new woman had more spine to her than most men he knew, which he meant as high praise. Pete Abelson, who was 34 and had been married once and took a broader view, said that it was nobody's business and they should mind their work. Hector said nothing, which was his way of saying a great deal. Tommy Reyes, who was young enough to still find romance straightforwardly exciting rather than complicated, was simply rooting for it with an enthusiasm he made no attempt to conceal. The matter came into sharper focus for everyone in the second week of December, when a man rode up to the Ring H on a gray horse and asked for Wilhelmina Whitaker by name. His name was Davis Leach. He was 40 years old, well-dressed in the manner of a man who wanted to appear prosperous, with the kind of face that was smooth in a way that had nothing to do with youth. He said he was from Harton, Kansas, which was Wilhelmina's former home. He said he was an old acquaintance and had business to discuss. Gilbert was in the yard when Leach arrived, and he noted the way Wilhelmina's face went completely still when she came to the door and saw who was on the horse. Not frightened. She was not a woman easily frightened, but still and watchful in a way that was different from her usual watchfulness, which was simply the watchfulness of an intelligent person. This was the watchfulness of someone who has seen a particular kind of trouble before and is doing rapid calculations. Leach got off his horse with a practiced ease and swept his hat off and smiled, and the smile did not reach any part of his face above his cheekbones. "Mina," he said, "you are a difficult woman to run down. Mr. Leach," Wilhelmina said from the porch. She did not come down the steps. "I have a letter for you," Leach said. "From Edward." Edward was, Gilbert had gathered from various small references over the weeks, the name of Wilhelmina's former husband. "Edward can direct his correspondence to my lawyer in Wichita," Wilhelmina said calmly. "Mr. Pickett here handles my mail." She had extended the lawyer's name slightly, the way a person extends the name of a large companion standing just off to the side. Leach glanced at Gilbert, assessing. Gilbert did not move or change expression. He was leaning against the corral fence with his arms crossed, which was simply where he had happened to be standing when Leach arrived, but which happened to present quite well as a man who was settled and had no intention of going anywhere. "This is a private matter, Mina," Leach said. "Then Edward should not have sent a messenger," she said. "There is nothing private to discuss. The divorce was finalized in August. The court's decision stands. I suggest you ride back to Alamosa and take the stage north." Something flickered in Leach's smooth face. "Edward is not without resources," he said. "There is a question about certain property that was." "That question was settled in court," Wilhelmina said. "In my favor, with documented evidence. The court found in my favor on all disputed items." She said this with a precision that suggested she had rehearsed the exact words many times, possibly in the dark of the East Room in the middle of the night, and had found that precision was better armor than anger. "There is nothing to discuss, Mr. Leach. I would ask you to leave the property." Leach turned and looked at Gilbert again, more directly this time. "This your spread?" "It is," Gilbert said. "She work for you, she does. You know what she's running from." "She is not running from anything," Gilbert said. "She rode towards something." "That is a different action entirely, and a man who could not tell the difference between the two would have some difficulty on a cattle drive." A long pause. Leach put his hat back on. "Edward is a patient man," he said to Wilhelmina. "He can be patient all he likes," she said. "He will find the court's decision remains the same regardless of how long he waits." Leach got back on his gray horse. He did not say anything else. He rode back down the lane toward the main road, and Cord, who happened to be fixing a post at the near edge of the yard, watched him go with an expression of profound satisfaction that he did not bother to conceal. When the gray horse was out of sight, Wilhelmina remained standing on the porch steps for a moment. She was holding the door handle behind her with one hand, not for support but as if she needed something solid to touch. Then she let go of it and looked at Gilbert. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." "I had not finished with the corral," he said. Something went through her eyes, quick, warm, almost amused. "Of course," she said. "The corral. The court's decision stands," he said. "He will not be back." "No," she agreed. "Men like Leach do not come back when there is nothing left to leverage." She looked down the empty lane for another moment. "Edward sent him because he thought I would be unsettled, alone out here, uncertain. Were you?" She considered this with her characteristic fairness. "For approximately 30 seconds, she said. "Then I remembered that unsettled is a condition I have had a great deal of practice recovering from, and I recovered from it." Gilbert looked at her on the porch steps, with the December light falling across her face and the mountains enormous and permanent behind her, and felt the accumulation in the corner of himself reach a kind of weight and mass that he could no longer pretend was just interesting information being filed away. It had become something else. It had become something he was going to have to address, because he was a man who addressed things rather than letting them fester. He was just not entirely certain yet how to address this particular thing without disturbing a working arrangement that had, over the course of 2 months, become one of the most functional and quietly satisfying arrangements he had known in 30 years of running a ranch largely by himself. Christmas came to the San Luis Valley with a week of deep snow and the particular silence that only snow can create, a silence that is not absence but presence, as if the world has put its hands over your ears and said, "Listen." Gilbert and Wilhelmina and Maria ate Christmas dinner together, which Maria had made a considerable production of a roasted chicken, tamales, a sweet potato pudding, and a dried apple pie that she had been working on since the previous week. Maria sat with them, which she did not usually do, and the table had a feel to it that evening that Gilbert had not experienced since he was very small, before the specific difficulties of his father had made family meals a thing to be endured rather than enjoyed. After Maria went to bed and the fire had burned down to a warm, deep orange, Wilhelmina said, "I have something for you." She went to the East Room and came back with a small, flat package wrapped in brown paper. "I asked Maria to bring it from a limosa on her last trip," she said, and handed it to him. It was a book. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a leather-bound volume with gold letters on the cover, the Journals of Lewis and Clark, edited and compiled by Elliott Cowes, published that very year, 1888. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at her. "You mentioned the expedition once," she said. "In the context of the valley's geography, you said you had always meant to read the full account." "I did say that," he agreed. He had said it 3 weeks ago, in passing, over supper, in the way you mention things you have always meant to do and never quite gotten to. He had not imagined she had noted it with any particular attention. "It is a very good addition," she said. "Mr. Cowes is thorough." "Thank you," he said. He said it the way a man says something when he means considerably more than the words contain, and the way you say it in those circumstances is carefully, because the weight of the meaning must be carried in the delivery. She looked at him steadily. "You are welcome," she said, and in her voice was the same quality, the same careful fullness. He had gotten her something, too. He had been to a limosa the previous week on supply business, and had spent 20 minutes in the dry goods store that also stocked a small selection of saddlery and personal items, and he had bought a pair of leather riding gloves, good ones, made from deerskin and lined with wool, because he had noticed in November that her gloves were too thin for Colorado winters, and she had not replaced them, which probably meant she had not wanted to spend the money, which she would not have if her budget was what she had described when she arrived. She put them on at once, right there in the firelight, and flexed her hands in them with an expression of pure, uncomplicated pleasure that was one of the finest things he had seen in recent memory. "They are exactly right," she said. "Good," he said. They sat by the dying fire for another hour, not saying much, which had become a comfortable thing between them. The specific comfort of silence shared with someone whose presence makes the silence easier rather than heavier. Outside, the snow fell again, softly, without any urgency, as if it had all the time in the world. January of 1889 brought a hard freeze that tested the cattle and the hands and the fences in equal measure, and Gilbert spent most of it on horseback in temperatures that had no business existing. And when he came in each evening with ice on his hat brim and his fingers half numb inside his gloves, Wilhelmina had taken to having coffee ready in the main room without making a ceremony of it, just having it there, and he had taken to not remarking on it, just drinking it. And this was perhaps as close to domestic harmony as either of them had been in a very long time. In the middle of January, there was a night when the temperature dropped so hard and fast that the pipes in the ranch house froze and one of the cattle in the near pasture went down with cold exhaustion, and Gilbert was up until 3 in the morning dealing with both problems. And when he finally came in from the barn where he had spent 2 hours with the struggling cow, Wilhelmina was sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp lit, writing something in the ledger. She looked up. "The cow?" she asked. "She will be fine. She is up and drinking." He sat down heavily at the kitchen table because the dining room was farther and he was very tired. She got up without a word, poured him coffee from the pot she had kept on the back of the stove, and set it in front of him. Then she sat back down and returned to the ledger, and he drank his coffee and looked at the lamplight on her face and thought very clearly and without any particular drama, "I am in love with this woman." It was not a surprise exactly. It was more like the end of a very long sentence, the final word arriving with quiet inevitability after all the others had done their preparatory work. He had been moving toward this conclusion for months, had been aware of the direction of the movement, had simply been too careful, or too slow, or too accustomed to the reliable shape of his solitude to step into the conclusion directly. He was 52 years old. He had spent 30 years building the finest ranch in the valley. He had eaten every meal alone for 30 years, or very nearly, and had called it sufficient. He had, it now seemed clear, been wrong about the sufficiency. He did not say anything that night. He was too tired, and it was the middle of the night, and he was a man who believed in saying important things at the right moment rather than the convenient one. He finished his coffee, thanked her for staying up, which was a thing he had never thanked her for before because she had never done it before, and went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while, listening to the frozen silence of the ranch and the distant sound of cattle on the cold pasture, and felt with considerable clarity the fact of the 30 years behind him and the undetermined number of years in front of him, and the fact that those years were going to be different from the ones that had passed, because something had arrived in them that had not been there before. Something direct and warm and honest and capable of sitting down at a man's table without asking permission and making the table feel, for the first time in 30 years, like a place a person might want to come home to. He made his decision. He was thorough about it, as he was thorough about all decisions of consequence. He thought it through from several directions, considered the possibilities, considered the obstacles. The difference in their ages was not large. She was 36 and he was 52, which was 16 years, and he spent some time on that, examining it for fairness, because he was a fair man and he did not want to be unfair to her. And he considered what she had told him about her life and her marriage and her brother and the kind of woman she was. And he came to the conclusion that he was going to say what he had to say, and that he was going to say it directly, because that was the only way he knew how to say things, and it was also, as far as he could tell, the only way she wanted. Things said. He waited 3 more days, partly because February had arrived with another storm and the ranch demanded all hands, and partly because he wanted to be sure of himself in the way he was sure about permanent decisions. Completely, without reservation, without a corner of doubt left unexamined. On the 4th day, which was a Sunday in early February with the storm blown out, and the sky a hard, brilliant blue, and the snow lying clean and deep across the valley all the way to the mountains, he found Wilhelmina in the study working on the quarterly cattle tally and said, from the doorway, "When you are at a stopping point, I would like to talk to you." She looked up. "Now is fine," she said. He came into the study and stood near the window. She set her pen down and turned in the chair to face him, with the direct, patient attention she gave to all things that mattered. "I am going to say something," he said, "and I want to be plain about it because plain is the only way I know how to be, and I believe it is also the only way you would want to hear it." "Yes," she said. "I have worked this ranch for 30 years," he said, "and I have been correct in most of my assessments and wrong in a few, and the thing I was most wrong about was the sufficient thing. The idea that one was sufficient." He stopped. He had rehearsed this somewhat and was now departing from the rehearsal, which he had not entirely anticipated. "You have been here for 4 months, and in those 4 months the ranch has run better than it has in years, but that is not the principal thing I want to say. The principal thing I want to say is that I have been happier in those 4 months than I have been in a very long time, and the reason is you. Specifically you. Not the work you do, though you do it excellently. You specifically. The way you think and the way you talk, and the way you are honest about things and the way you sit across from me at that table." He paused. "I am asking, in as plain a fashion as I can manage, whether you might be willing to consider whether there is something between us that is worth pursuing. And I want to be honest that the something I have in mind is permanent, because I am not a man who builds temporary things." Wilhelmina Whitaker looked at him for a long, full moment. There was something moving in her face, not surprise, or not only surprise, something deeper and quieter, like relief arriving slowly after a long absence. "I want to ask you something first," she said, "not to test you, just because I need to know it." "Ask," he said. "You are asking because of you," she said, "not because of me. What I mean is, you are not asking out of pity for my circumstances, or because I have been convenient, or because the ranch needed a bookkeeper and it makes sense to make it formal. You are asking because you want to." "Because I want to," he confirmed, with considerable clarity. She was quiet for another moment, and he let the moment be, because he was a man who understood that silence was not absence but frequently its opposite. "I came here," she said at last, "because Clement told me this was the finest place in the world, and because I needed somewhere to go, and because I have learned that when you have nothing left to lose you might as well go toward the finest thing available and see what happens." She looked at her hands, then back at him. "I did not come here intending this, but I have not in 6 months or 6 years expected anything about this when I walked through that door. And I find that I am very glad I sat down at your table, Gilbert Hunter." She said his full name like a conclusion. "Yes, I am willing to consider it. I am more than willing." He crossed the room to her. He took her hand, which was sitting on the arm of the chair, and held it carefully, the way he held things he intended to keep. "Good," he said. She looked up at him, and her smile came in full this time, the rare kind, and it was, as he had suspected it would be, absolutely worth the wait. They were married in March of 1889 in the small church in Alamosa, which Maria and the entirety of the Ring H crew attended with what could only be described as deep communal satisfaction. Thomas Pryor, long retired now but still living nearby, came and stood near the back and afterward said privately to Hector Garza that it was the best day he had seen in 30 years of knowing Gilbert Hunter, and Hector agreed without qualification. The ceremony was simple and straightforward, which suited both of them. The minister, a young man named Whitfield who had been in Alamosa for only a year, seemed slightly surprised by the economy of the whole thing. The vows said clearly, without theatrical decoration, by two people who meant each word precisely and needed no amplification. Wilhelmina wore a deep blue dress that she had made herself over the previous 2 weeks, working by the evening fire, and she wore her dark auburn hair up but softly, and she looked, in Gilbert's view, like a woman who had arrived at a place she had been traveling toward for a long time and was satisfied with the destination. Tommy Reyes, standing in the second row with his hat in his hands, was visibly emotional about the whole thing, which the other hands found extremely endearing and would tease him about for approximately the next 6 months. They had a proper wedding supper back at the ranch house, which Maria had been preparing for a week, and which involved more food than strictly necessary for the number of people present, because Maria believed in abundance on the occasions that deserved it. The dining table had never had so many people around it, and Gilbert sat at the head of it and looked down its length at the faces of his people. The hands, and Hector, and Maria, and Thomas Pryor, and his wife at the other end, talking easily to Cord Mullins about horses, and felt something that he had no ready word for, something warm and broad and deeply rooted. Later, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Maria had gone to her room, and Thomas Pryor had ridden home in the clear cold March night, Gilbert and Wilhelmina sat by the fire in the main room as they had sat so many evenings, but differently. She had taken off the blue dress and put on a warm wool robe, and she was sitting sideways in the chair with her feet tucked under her, reading, and he was looking at the fire. And the difference was simply that she was now entirely, formally, legally, and in the eyes of God and Colorado territory, his and he was hers, and the ranch house had a feel to it that evening that he could only describe internally as complete. "Are you still awake?" she asked without looking up from her book. "Yes, you have been very quiet." "I have been thinking," he said. "What about," he considered how to say it, "about the 30 years before tonight," he said, "and the fact that I would not exchange them because they made the ranch and the ranch is the truest thing I have done, and the fact that they are finished being sufficient on their own." She looked up from the book. She looked at him with the steady, full attention he had come to value above almost any other thing a person could offer. "They are not wasted," she said. "Not 1 hour of them." "No," he agreed. "They were building towards something. I just did not know it." "Clement knew," she said softly. "He was right about you." "He was a good judge of things," Gilbert said. "I told him so when he worked here, not often enough." "He knew," she said again. She closed her book. "Come to bed, Gilbert. The ranch will be here in the morning." "The ranch will always be here," he said, but he got up and he held out his hand and she took it. Spring of 1889 came to the valley in the way it always did, indifferently to any particular human calendar, but magnificently in its own terms. The creek running high and cold with snowmelt, the grass returning in that vivid particular green that only exists for a few weeks before it deepens towards summer, the aspens leafing out in a pale gold-green light that turned the mountainsides into something impractical and beautiful. The cattle had calved well. The spring stock was fat and priced well with the Denver buyer, and the first major sale of the season was more profitable than any Gilbert had managed in the previous 5 years, partly because Wilhelmina had reorganized the correspondence with the buyers in a way that got the Ring H's offerings in front of more buyers at the right moment, and partly because she had suggested, very quietly but with solid reasoning, that offering a small set of premium breeding stock separately from the main sale could command a significantly higher price, and she had been entirely right. Hector Garza, presenting the final numbers to Gilbert in the study, said that if they kept this up, the Ring H would be the most profitable operation in the valley within 3 years. Gilbert looked at the numbers and looked at Wilhelmina, who was sitting at her side of the study making notes on the supply orders for the following quarter, and she looked up briefly and gave him the small, satisfied nod of a woman who has done the arithmetic and is not surprised by the result. In the late spring, something else happened that was not on any ledger but had its own kind of significance. Wilhelmina discovered she was expecting a child. She told him on a May evening, out on the porch in the warm dusk with the swallows cutting arcs across the orange sky and the smell of new grass rising from the meadow. She told him straightforwardly, the way she told him all things, looking at him fully, letting the information speak for itself. He was quiet for a moment that she apparently misread because she said, "I know we had not spoken of it specifically. Wilhelmina," he said. He turned toward her and took her face in his two weathered, work-hardened hands with the care of a man handling something irreplaceable, and he looked at her for a long moment. "I am going to say something that I may not be able to say again with the same force because I am not made for grand statements. Are you listening?" "Yes," she said, very still. "This is the finest thing that has happened to me in 52 years, he said, "bar none, including the ranch." He let that sit for a moment. "I wanted to be clear about that." She put her hands over his, which were still cradling her face, and she held them there, and whatever she was feeling moved through her eyes with a completeness and depth that he did not try to interpret because some things do not need interpretation, they simply need to be witnessed. "Bar none," she repeated quietly. "Bar none," he confirmed. The summer was long and warm, and the valley shimmered under a sky that seemed to go up forever. Wilhelmina continued to work through the summer months, though she had delegated the more physical aspects of her ranch duties. She had, by this time, taken on a range of responsibilities that had quietly grown well beyond bookkeeping, including managing the supply relationships in Alamosa and handling the correspondence with the Territorial Land Office, which had become important again when a new survey of the valley had raised some questions about the Ring H's northern boundary that needed careful documentation to address. She handled it all from the study, and the ranch ran with a precision it had never quite achieved before, even in its best years. She and Maria had developed, over the months, a friendship of the specific, practical variety that forms between women who respect each other's competence and do not require performance from each other. Maria was privately fiercely protective of Wilhelmina, in the way she had never been of anyone before at the Ring H, and she expressed this by making sure the most nutritious food was consistently available, and by saying very little about it, which was how Maria expressed all her most deeply felt positions. In September, with the aspens beginning to turn again, and the year making its cycle back toward the season in which Wilhelmina had arrived, a letter came from a woman named Ruth Caldwell, now in San Francisco, who said she had not been able to trace her friend Wilhelmina until a mutual acquaintance mentioned she had gone to the San Luis Valley of Colorado, and that she hoped the letter found her, and that wherever she was, she hoped the courage had been worth it. Wilhelmina wrote back a letter of 12 pages. She told Gilbert this was excessive, but that there was a great deal to say. He told her 12 pages seemed about right for the amount that had happened, and she laughed, which was one of his favorite sounds, easy and genuine and completely without self-consciousness. Ruth wrote back, and the correspondence became regular. She said, in her second letter, that Wilhelmina's description of the San Luis Valley and the ring H and a certain Gilbert Hunter sounded suspiciously like happiness, and that happiness in a woman who had fought as hard for hers as Wilhelmina was one of the most satisfying things in the known world. Wilhelmina read this to Gilbert at supper and watched his face do the thing it did when something moved him, very slight, very controlled, a small deepening at the corners of his eyes that she had learned to recognize as the outward boundary of a feeling that ran considerably deeper than the surface. The child arrived in late November of 1889, during a snowstorm that was somewhat dramatic in its timing but ultimately not inconvenient, since they were all at the ranch, and the doctor from Alamosa had been summoned in sufficient time. It was a boy. He was loud from the first moment, and large, and had his mother's brown eyes and what Maria immediately identified as his father's jaw, which she mentioned 3 times in the first hour, with a satisfaction she made no effort to conceal. They named him Clement Gilbert Hunter, and the naming of him was the quietest and most important thing that had been done in the ranch house in 30 years of important things. Gilbert held his son for the first time in the gray morning light after the storm, with the snow deep on the porch and the valley white and still below the mountains, and Wilhelmina watching him from the bed, where she was drinking the broth Maria had pressed on her, and he felt the specific, unnameable weight of the new small person in his arms, the weight of continuation, of something begun that would now outlast him, of the ranch and the land and the years he had poured into this valley becoming, at last, something that had a future as well as a past. "He is very serious," he said. "He is 3 hours old," Wilhelmina said, with gentle amusement. "He is serious," Gilbert maintained. "He is already thinking about the fence lines." She laughed, tiredly and fully, and Clement Gilbert Hunter, apparently in response, stopped being quite so vocally displeased with the world for a moment, and the room was as close to perfect as a room gets. The years that followed were working years and full years, because a ranch like the Ring H did not pause for the personal, and neither Gilbert nor Wilhelmina was made for idleness, but they were also years with something woven through them that all the previous 30 had lacked. The meals at the long oak table were no longer solitary. Wilhelmina had seen to that from the very first day, sitting down across from him without asking, and she continued to see to it in all the ways that matter: conversation that was real, presence that was genuine, challenge when it was warranted and support when that was warranted instead. And always, always, the straight-backed, clear-eyed honesty of a woman who had learned through hard experience that the truth, however uncomfortable it might be in the short term, was the only foundation worth building on. In the spring of 1892, Wilhelmina discovered she was expecting again. She told Gilbert on the porch in the May dusk, same as before, and he got up from his chair and pulled her close to him in a wordless embrace that lasted a considerable while, because he was a man of few words but of strong feeling, and because he had learned over the years that she understood his silences as well as she understood his words, which was one of the gifts of knowing someone truly. The second child was a girl. They named her Clara, and she arrived in December of 1892 with considerably less drama than her brother, but with, as it quickly became apparent, a considerably stronger personal will for the size of her. Clara Hunter, by the age of 2, had the entire ranch staff wrapped around her smallest finger and was entirely aware of this fact, which Wilhelmina noted with the mild exasperation of a woman who knew exactly which parent was responsible. "She gets the will from you," Gilbert said when Wilhelmina pointed this out. "She does not," Wilhelmina said. "She looked at Pete Abelson yesterday and simply pointed at the corral gate and he went and opened it," Gilbert said, "without a word. She never spoke, she simply pointed. That is from your side of the family. That is from observing her father give orders from horseback without raising his voice for the entire span of her young life," Wilhelmina said crisply. "She has been taking notes." Gilbert looked at his daughter, who was sitting near the porch steps investigating a stick with the focused intensity of a mining asher, and thought that she was entirely correct, and that this was deeply satisfying, and that the ranch house had accumulated, since Wilhelmina had arrived at its door and sat down across from him without asking permission, more life in each square foot than it had contained in all its 30 previous years combined. In 1894, Thomas Pryor died at the age of 67, quietly, in his own bed on his own small spread, which was how he would have wanted it. Gilbert rode over when the news came and sat with the body for an hour before the others arrived, thinking about the young Confederate soldier who had shown up at a half-built cabin in the winter of 1862 looking for any kind of work, and had stayed for years and become, without either of them ever making it formal, the closest thing to a true friend that Gilbert had known through his building years. He said goodbye in the way he said important things quietly, without performance, and rode home in the afternoon light with the mountains enormous and indifferent around him. Wilhelmina had supper ready when he got home. She did not ask him how he was because she could see how he was. She let him eat and she ate across from him, and when he had pushed the plate away she said, "Tell me something about him that I do not already know." So he did. He talked about Thomas Pryor for an hour and a half, which was more words than he had used in any single conversation in recent memory, and she listened to all of it with the full, careful attention that she gave to all things that mattered, and by the end of it the shape of the grief had changed, the way shapes change when you look at them directly instead of around the edges. "He would have liked you," Gilbert said. "I know," she said without vanity. "He wrote me a note, 2 months after I arrived." "He sent it through Hector," Gilbert stared. "What did it say?" "It said, 'Good for you both, about time for him, considerably overdue.' TP," she smiled. "I thought you should know." He shook his head slowly, in the manner of a man who has discovered that the people around him have been having conversations he was entirely unaware of. "About time," he said. "About time," she confirmed. By 1895, Cord Mullins had married a young woman from Alamosa named Alina and moved onto a small allotment on the Ring H's eastern boundary, an arrangement Gilbert had proposed and which worked well for everyone. Tommy Reyes had grown from a 19-year-old following Cord around to a solid, reliable cowhand of 26 who had taken over the horse management entirely and was, by all accounts, one of the best horsemen in the valley. Pete Abelson had left the year before to go to New Mexico with a cattle outfit heading south, and his replacement was a young man of mixed Apache and Mexican heritage named Domingo Salinas, who was quiet and skilled, and who Hector had vouched for without reservation, which was worth more than any formal reference. The Ring H in 1895 was not the same ranch it had been in 1888. It was larger, better organized, better documented, more connected to the buyers and markets that made cattle ranching a viable rather than a merely possible enterprise. The stone house had a second room added on the east side in 1891 to accommodate the family, and a proper study with 2 desks, one for Gilbert and one for Wilhelmina, which had been Hector's tactful suggestion and which had been adopted without discussion because it was obviously correct. The long oak dining table now had around it, on most evenings, at least 4 people, Gilbert and Wilhelmina and Clement, who at 5 was already accompanying his father to the stable, and who asked precise, practical questions about horses that his father answered with the same serious thoroughness he brought to everything. And Clara, who at 2 was primarily interested in whatever was on other people's plates. On a Sunday evening in October of 1895, with the aspens gold again, and the air carrying the particular sharpness that means winter is making its preparations, Gilbert sat down at the long oak table across from Wilhelmina and thought, not for the first time, about the accumulated fact of the years. He was 59 now. She was 43. Clement was 5 and already more serious about the ranch than most grown men. Clara was 2 and already more determined about everything than most people ever became. The ranch was, by any honest measure, the finest in the valley and possibly far beyond it, and it had been that for years, but it was now also a home, fully and entirely, with all the weight and warmth that the word contains. Wilhelmina was reading a letter from Ruth Caldwell across the table, turning pages with the quick, absorbed attention she brought to correspondence she actually cared about. The lamp was lit between them. Maria was in the kitchen, and the sounds of her moving around came through the door with the smell of fresh bread. Clement was in the corner by the window with a stick that he was using to draw something in the dust of the windowsill, narrating it quietly to himself. Clara was asleep, though this was a temporary condition. Ruth is coming to visit, Wilhelmina said without looking up. When? She says March. She is traveling with her husband she married last year, you remember I told you, and they are touring the West. She would like to come through the valley. She is welcome, he said. We have the room. Wilhelmina lowered the letter. She looked at him the way she had looked at him at certain particular moments over the years, the full, steady look that went past the surface of things to whatever was actually there. You know, she said, you never asked me about it, whether I intended to stay permanently. That first day. Knew the answer, he said. You did not. I had a strong conviction, he amended. You are not a woman who does things by halves, Wilhelmina. When you sat down at that table, you had decided to stay. The question was whether I would be sensible enough to let you. She considered this for a moment. And were you? Eventually, he said. It took me 4 months. 4 months is reasonable, she said generously. For a man who had been alone for 30 years, he said, I thought it was rather quick. She laughed, and Clement looked up from his windowsill to see what was funny. And when he saw it was his parents looking at each other in the particular way they sometimes did, he apparently decided this was not his business, and returned to his stick and his drawing. The years continued to turn, as years do, with the mountains standing above them and the creek running and the cattle cycling through their seasons, and the ranch growing stronger and more rooted with each year that passed. In 1897, Cord Mullins and his wife Elena had their first child, and the Ring H community celebrated this with the kind of collective warmth that comes from people who have worked and eaten and weathered hard winters together for long enough to know that the sorrows and joys of one are distributed across all. In 1898, Clement Hunter turned 8 and began riding out with his father on the daily ranch rounds, in a way that was no longer merely accompanying but actually assisting, his serious eyes taking in everything, his questions increasingly specific and operational. Gilbert answered every one of them with the same fullness he had always brought to things that deserved full attention. Wilhelmina, watching them ride out together on a September morning with the ranch spread wide in gold behind them and the mountains ancient above, felt a particular species of gladness that she had no precise word for, something about the rightness of things, about the way life organizes itself around genuine effort and genuine love into shapes that make sense. She went back inside and sat at her desk and wrote Ruth a letter, which was something she did when she wanted to think clearly, because Ruth's imagined face on the other end of the page was a good audience for honest thinking. She wrote, I have been thinking lately about what it means to arrive somewhere. Not traveling through, not making do, but genuinely arriving at the place you were going even when you did not know where you were going. This valley is that place for me. This ranch. This family. I came here with $43 and a borrowed horse and a dead brother's recommendation, and I sat down at a man's table without being invited, and I have been sitting there ever since, and I would not change a single thing about it, not even the hard parts, because the hard parts are what proved it was real. Real things are hard. That is one of the clearest tests I know. She sealed the letter and took it with the day's correspondence to be sent to Alamosa, and then she went out to the covered porch and stood looking at the valley in the October morning, with the Rio Grande glittering in the distance, and the cottonwoods going gold along its banks, and the mountains rising blue and white behind everything, exactly as they had been rising for 10,000 years before she arrived, and would be rising for 10,000 after she was gone. Gilbert came back from the south pasture at midday, dusty and solid and real, and he came up onto the porch and stood beside her looking at the same view, and she leaned against him the way she had come to lean against him over the years, not for support exactly, but because two people who have chosen each other completely tend to occupy the same space in a natural gravitational way. "Hector says the south fence is holding," he said. "Good. Clement fixed the gate latch on the east corral this morning." "He did," she looked up at him. "By himself. He asked Tommy to show him, then he did it himself, twice, to be sure of it." A pause that carried pride so contained it was almost invisible. "Almost, he is going to be good." "He is already good," Wilhelmina said. "He is 8. "He is his father's son," Gilbert said, and she could hear what was below the plainness of it, the 30 years of solitary work that had become, in some way he had never fully articulated, a preparation for exactly this, a legacy preparing for a recipient, a foundation waiting for what it was always meant to hold. "He is his mother's son too," she said firmly. "The stubbornness, certainly," Gilbert agreed. She elbowed him, which was not the rebuttal she had intended but which accomplished something better, which was to make him smile, the real one, the rare one, the one that transformed his face from a landscape of settled competence to something younger and warmer and entirely, devastatingly sincere. The evening came as it always did, with the light going gold and then orange, and then a deep rose that set the mountains blazing before the dark came down. And Wilhelmina made sure supper was on the table because Maria had the evening off to visit her sister in town, and she and Gilbert and the 2 children sat around the long oak table in the warm light of the lamp, and they ate together as they had eaten together through 100 seasons and would eat through 100 more. And the table that had sat silent for 30 years was full of voices. Clement had opinions about the fence repairs he intended to make when he was older. Clara had opinions about the bread, which she felt needed more butter. Gilbert had questions for both of them about their respective days, which he asked with the same careful attention he brought to all things of consequence, because his children were things of consequence, were in fact the most consequential things he had encountered in a life of consequential things. Wilhelmina sat across from him at the table, same as she had on the first day, same as she would on every day that came after, and she listened to her family around her with the full, warm attention that was her truest gift. Later, when the children were in bed and the fire had settled to its deep winter orange and the house was quiet, Wilhelmina sat with a cup of coffee and Gilbert sat across from her, which was where he had been sitting for 9 years and where he intended to be sitting for the next 30, and the valley lay outside the windows dark and enormous and entirely at peace. "We should talk about expanding the upper pasture," she said. "In the morning," he said. Hector mentioned the north water access. "In the morning, Wilhelmina." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she had first seen when she sat down across from him without asking permission, the one she had not known how to read then, that she could now read as well as any of the ledgers she kept better, because it was written in a language that required no translation, no experience, no prior knowledge of accounting or cattle or Colorado Territory law. It simply said, "You are here, and I am here, and this is where we are." She set down her coffee cup. "All right," she said, "the morning." Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods in the dark the way it had moved through them for 30 years of solitary nights, and it sounded the same as it always had, But it was heard differently now, through walls that held more warmth than they had ever been built to contain. The Ring H spread across the San Luis Valley in the years that followed like something that had always been there, permanent and deep-rooted and alive with the particular vitality of a place that is genuinely loved. Its fences were tight. Its cattle were fat. Its accounts were immaculate, kept in Wilhelmina's precise and legible hand in a series of leather-bound ledgers that would eventually tell the history of those years better than any other record could, because they recorded not just the numbers but the decisions behind the numbers, the reasoning, the considerations, the small notes in the margins that Wilhelmina sometimes added when a decision had a context that the bare figures did not capture. Clement Hunter grew into exactly the person the serious 8-year-old had suggested he would be: methodical, patient, skilled, with his father's capacity for sustained effort and his mother's capacity for clear thinking under pressure. By the time he was 16, he was riding as a full hand, and by 20 he was foreman in training under Hector Garza, who was getting to the age where passing things on was more satisfying than holding them. Clara Hunter grew into a young woman of such determined and particular character that the valley's various young men regarded her with a mixture of admiration and something closely resembling respectful caution, which she found entirely satisfactory. And at the long oak table in the Ring H's stone house, through the snow and the thaw and the heat and the gold and the snow again, in the cycling permanent beauty of that extraordinary valley, with the mountain standing above everything like a promise that had always been kept, Gilbert Hunter sat at the head of the table he had built 30 years before and looked down its length at the life that had arrived when he had stopped believing he needed it to, and found that 30 years of solitude had made him, in the end, more grateful for its ending than he could ever have been if it had ended sooner. And Wilhelmina sat across from him, same as she had on the first day, the day she had ridden 11 miles on a borrowed horse and walked through a stranger's door and sat down at his table without asking permission, the most consequential thing she had ever done, the thing from which everything else, the clean ledgers and the resolved water rights and the 2 children and the 9 years and all the years still to come, had followed with the quiet inevitability of a river finding its level. She had asked Maria once in the 2nd year whether she thought it had been too bold that first day, walking in like that. Maria had looked at her with an expression of such profound practical wisdom that Wilhelmina had almost laughed. Too bold for what? Maria had said. He needed someone to sit down. You sat down. The boldness was just doing the thing. Just doing the thing. On an evening in early spring, with the snow finally off the lower pastures and the first green coming back to the valley, and the mountains showing the years new white at their peaks in a way that meant they had come through another winter hole, Gilbert looked across the table at his wife, who was explaining to Clara that yes, learning to manage the accounts was necessary, and no, it was not as tedious as it appeared from the outside, and he thought about the day she had walked through his door, which he still thought about. Not with the bewilderment of that first moment, but with the deep, settled gratitude of a man who has had 9 years to understand what walked through that door. He had spent 30 years building the finest ranch in the valley. He had eaten every meal alone and called it sufficient and been wrong. And then Wilhelmina Whitaker had sat down across from him and not asked permission, and the table had been full ever since, and it would stay full, because it had been waiting all along for exactly this. For her voice across the plates and her hands across the ledger pages and her steadiness in every hard winter and her laughter in the spring evenings on the porch when the swallows came back and the valley smelled like new grass and all the 30 years of solitary building had become not an end in itself, but the foundation of something built for 2. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked up from the conversation with Clara, looked at him with those direct brown eyes, and she knew what it meant, the same way she always knew, the same way she had known since before they had words for any of it. The mountain stood above the valley. The creek ran bright and cold from its mountain source. The cattle grazed in the greening pastures. And at the long oak table in the stone house of the Ring H, the finest ranch in the San Luis Valley, the two people who had built it into what it had become held hands across the boards of 30 years of work and looked at each other in the lamplight and found that everything was exactly where it was supposed to be.